Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. I am so grateful to have Lilli Correll back on the show. We have an interview that we did a couple of months ago. I'll make sure to link that up in the show notes, where we really talked about the concept of trauma and resolving to rise, which is also the name of her book. But today I've invited her back to talk about adoption. We're featuring adoption on the podcast this month as part of National Adoption Month. And one thing that she and I really did connect over was this idea of epigenetics. And it was something that I did ask her about on that first episode at the very tail end of the episode. And then when we stopped recording, she and I had this awesome conversation on the topic. And I thought, well, this needs to be shared too. This information is stuff that people need to know. And it's perfect. It's the perfect topic to tie into Adoption Month. So we're going to dive into nature versus nurture. We're going to be talking about the science behind epigenetics, what it really is. It is newer science. It's new stuff. We're also going to talk about environmental factors, intergenerational work. All this stuff is going to be such good stuff, especially if you're considering adoption for you and your family, or if you're in the throes of it right now, like I am with a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. So without further ado, Lilli, welcome back to the show. I'll have you just kick things off with, again, reminding our listeners who you are and what you do.
Thank you. My name, like you said, is Lilli Correll. I wrote a book and published it I think my 1-year anniversary was this week, of Resolve to Rise, when I became a best-selling author. It's really led to a lot of opportunities to get in front of, honestly, a lot of varied and mixed groups of individuals who seem to really resonate with the ideas, just in terms of, we all have our suffering, and we don't talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, we don't heal from it. And I think that's really, really relevant for what we're going to talk about today. I am an executive within United Health Group, probably the largest healthcare company in the world. So I get the opportunity to visit with all kinds of experts in behavioral health, physical health, pharmacy, to learn just all about how our system is working and not working. And really try to evolve all of that so that it works better for especially individuals with serious mental illness and substance use disorder. So it's really my area of passion, in addition to just helping people understand that if they've experienced trauma, which is all too common, that they're not irreparably damaged. So really excited to continue our conversation. I'm so glad to be a part of Adoption Month.
Yeah. And you've connected me to the amazing Jenny Lord, who's also going to be featured on the podcast as well, the founder of Chosen. So you guys can be on the lookout for that podcast as well.
I can't wait to watch it myself.
You guys are such a powerhouse combo and are doing so many great things in this realm. So let's start with just kind of where we left off, right? Like talking about just maybe defining what is epigenetic, what does that even mean? What's the science behind it? And then we'll go from there.
So I wanted to throw out a name, which I know you always enjoy, so you can write this down. Mark Wolynn, Wollynn. He's the author of It Didn't Start With You, was one of the originators of this idea of this family imprint that we're born with. And this is what he said. I wanted to read it. I hope that's okay. The emotional history you share with your family began even before you were conceived. When your grandmother was 5 months pregnant with your mother, the egg that will eventually become you was already present in your mother's womb. That means your mother and your grandmother all share the same biological environment. Whatever your grandmother experienced, her traumas, her sadness, her grief, can become your emotional inheritance. So one of the things that Mark points out in his book and in a lot of his, if you listen to him speak, and he has a website that's aptly named Mark Wolynn, you'll see that there was this experiment that was done, and this is really, really new stuff. This probably came about 10 years ago. I think it was actually 2013 when we started talking about this inherited family trauma. But they did this experiment with mice, and they basically had these mice, and I think we talked about this a little on the last episode, but they took the mice and they let them smell cherry blossom, and they paired that with electric shock. And they did this over the course of time, to the point where they took the electric shock away, the mouse would smell the cherry blossom, and the mouse would have a fight or flight kind of stress reaction. Well, what they found was the pups of the mice who had that experience but didn't didn't have that conditioning actually had the same reaction to cherry blossoms, and so did their grandpups. They even, this is something I just learned in the last couple of weeks, they even took the sperm and the ovary from a mouse and they put it in another mouse, right? So that's essentially adoption, although it's in vitro fertilization, whatever. And the pups and grandpups again had this experience with cherry blossoms. So it was inherited. The DNA is not changed, but the way the DNA is expressed is changed. So the really cool thing and the really promising thing, I think, for all of us, adopted or not adopted, is that when they went back and they took a mouse who had had this conditioning and they started pairing, they had them exposed to the cherry blossom smell, but then had this positive, loving, calming environment with the cherry blossom smell, that over time, the DNA, the way it was expressed, changed. And so what came forth from that then was a new genetic inheritance in that line. And I think that's why this is a topic we want to talk about, because it's not just this sad story of crap, my grandmother, well, my dad's sister hung herself. So I noticed, so I wasn't there, that was before I was born, but I noticed that any time that my child and I would be in an argument or something would happen and maybe they were going to bed, I'd have this fear that they were going to commit suicide. And I didn't know where that was coming from, right? But it's part of my inheritance. The good news is I'm not stuck with that. I can work through that. A lot of times what happens, and hopefully we can dig into this a little bit more, is that it's the things that aren't spoken of that get a hold of us. And so you hear story after story of family secrets and things like that. So it's honestly, you may not be in an adoption situation, but actually you may not know what it is that's causing your reaction that you notice is kind of out of sorts with your own experiences.
Yeah, that's such a good way to start, because I remember you talking about the mice thing last time, but we didn't dive deep enough into it to really understand. But that's so powerful to think that something that previous generations experienced as stress, younger generations experience the same without having the stress, like without having the shock, right? But it's also equally as powerful. I love this analogy. Like, it's a perfect way to start this off, because it's so great to think that like just changing the environment, like just changing that, and I'm simplifying what you just said, but I need to do it for my own brain purposes. Hearing you say it makes so much sense, because it's like that cherry blossom, making a new association, giving a new environment and a new connection to that can happen. And so I love what you just said about we're not stuck, right? Like we have the ability to sort of change this. I think this is going to be a great topic for today. So it makes me want to start here, because I know when I interviewed Jenny Lord and Andra and the people that I've already interviewed for this month's adoption features, this is sort of where we've started. And that is this idea that making sure people understand that adoption comes from loss, and it starts with loss, and it comes from, there's some sense of trauma, right? Whether it's actual physical in utero trauma, which I've experienced that with one of my adopted children, or emotional trauma. And so I want to start there with our conversation and just kind of see where you take us. But I want to make sure that we establish that, and I also like to say this too, because there are couples that are, or young women that are looking to adopt, sometimes that journey happens as a result of loss for yourself too. Miscarriage or, infertility or whatever. So sometimes there's loss on both sides. So sometimes this is something that's important to address, because from the get-go, right? I think about the moment that my first child was handed to me out of the womb and she went right to my chest, right? In that moment is just this contradictory experience of both loss and joy. And it's so hard to put it into words until you're in that room and you're in that situation, but it's both things experienced at the same time, and it doesn't go away, right? Like that's always happening. That's always existing. And as the child gets older, at least what we're experiencing, right, is questions start to come up. And a lot of times it has to do with like, who am I? Like, who is this? What is this genetic line that I'm part of that I have no association with? The story of me that I don't know, right? So let's start there with just this idea of adoption starting with loss and trauma.
Thank you for bringing it back to yeah, that's really one of the things that Mark Wolin talks about in his work is this idea of a break in the bond. And that can happen outside of adoption as well. It can happen that a mother is taken away. Let's say they have in the instance of, I had a friend who had a psychotic break right after, which is not uncommon if you have bipolar disorder to have, right? Increased mania, and she had a psychotic break. So she was away from her son for a period of time. That actually can create a break in the bond. That can lead to some pretty extreme emotional responses. But when you have an adoption, you know that happened. That's 100%. There was a break in the bond, right? Because you had this mom that you were growing in for 9 months or 8.5 months or whatever, your story is 8 months, that you're connecting with. And that mom is most likely dealing with the distress of knowing I'm giving this child up for adoption in one way or the other, right? That's something I'm not going to be with this child. Is this going to be the right thing? Lots of stress, lots of duress. And that duress becomes a part of that experience for that child that's in utero. So they're coming into the world with this stress around belonging, around big issues, right? Of like things that feel very catastrophic and profound. So I love what you said about there was this complexity of sadness and joy, right? And I don't think you said it in those exact words, but the idea that you were holding space for the whole of what was happening there. And I think that's really powerful. But there's going to be that break in the bond, and there's going to be the tendency then, as we get into other intimate relationships, to feel this sense of wanting that person to fill that need, to take care of us in some way emotionally, to help kind of validate our existence. And that kind of thing can powerfully impact any relationship. And then when you get pregnant yourself, it might bring up things too, right? Because your mom had this whole experience, which then becomes part of how her DNA is expressed. It gets passed on to you. So then you notice when you have a baby, even though you have no intention of giving up your child, you might be terrified that you're going to somehow let them down, abandon them, not be enough for them, whatever those things are. And that it's like, it doesn't logically match up, right, with who you are. And if somebody asks you, well, are you planning on leaving your child? Or are you planning on, you're like, no, that's ridiculous. It's not where I am. But it's, again, that DNA that gets passed on is powerful. And so it's being able to recognize that that's the story, right? Even though you don't know mom, you don't know maybe the details of, sometimes people do when they're adopted, they know more of the details of what happened with their mom. They had a drug addiction, or they were 12 years old, or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. But, it really is going to vary in terms of how it gets expressed. So I am glad you started with that.
Yeah, I think, essentially it's like inherited fears, right? Mm-hmm. It's inherited fears. It makes me think about my own story. The only thing I know about my birth mother, which I've shared on the podcast before, is that she was a young, petite woman that had just kind of committed to her future with education and whatnot, and walked into my mom's, happened to be my adoptive mother's OBGYN's office. Her OBGYN was actually the one that connected this whole thing together and is the reason that I have my parents. But she walked in 8 months pregnant and said, I need help. I want to place this child for adoption. And of course, I know nothing else about the story aside from that. And so, but what I do know is I've always had a personal, deep fear of pregnancy. Like, I've never desired it. I've never, I have friends that are like, oh my gosh, like, I can't wait to be pregnant. I can't wait for the glow. I can't wait to feel the baby kicking in me. And my first reaction to all that was like, ugh, like, no, thank you, and it's not that I'm like grossed out by it, but it makes me wonder, like, how much of her fears at that time are my fears regarding the same thing. So hearing you say that brings a whole new perspective for me as well. it makes me think, on this topic of sort of nature versus nurture, it makes me think about our experience too with my oldest. We had the great fortune of being in the room when she was born. Now, if you want to talk about one of life's most awkward situations, a woman being in the room of another woman's birth, it's an interesting experience. But I will say that when it happened, like when she was actually born, birth mom had made the choice previously that she did not, she wanted the baby to be taken to us and for us to go to a separate room. And that's a choice that birth mothers make, and they can change their mind just like with everything else. And so in the moment where my oldest was born, the birth mom changed her mind and said, no, she was, of course, came out crying and screaming as they do. And she changed her mind and did want the baby placed on her. And I will tell you that, having never birthed a child myself, but being in the room for that moment, the nature piece is so strong. It is so strong. I mean, she went from these wailing newborn cries, was instantly placed on her birth mother's belly. Her birth mother, I'll never forget, like stroked the side of her face, and the crying ceased. And it was like this beautiful moment, and I'll never forget it. And I remember thinking, like, I mean, there's no way to describe it except for, again, coming back to that combination of sadness and joy. But me, the way I saw it, having been adopted myself, it was like this full circle moment of like,
Oh, wow.
this is love. This is not a reason for no love. Like this is love on both sides.
I love
And
that.
so the nature piece is so strong, right? And I remember for me, like the instant feeling was, what a beautiful thing, but also, am I going to be capable of loving this child and soothing this child and being this person without the nature piece, right? And I think this is a question that comes up a lot for people who are pursuing adoption, at least the couples that I've talked to just personally, is, am I capable of loving another child as my own? Right. And that's something that I think this is essentially what the question is, right? This child is not biologically mine. And so what are those differences going to be? So I want to kind of go there with the conversation here before we dive into like raising the child and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
It's interesting. I don't know if I've spoken about this, but I actually adopted an adult foster care alumni. She was 23 when I adopted her, which most people are like, what? I didn't know you could adopt an adult. And my response to that is, when do you outgrow the need to call your mom or your dad? And, I, like many new parents, I mean, I was new to her as a parent, go in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed thinking this is going to be a magical experience and she's going to be so grateful because we're just going to love her so much. But her trauma played out just like it does sometimes with children who have that epigenetic, or they experience trauma themselves. And my love for her, it was the weirdest thing. It was just like, I just felt like she was my daughter. That's why I adopted her. Cause I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm treating you like my daughter. I'm talking to you like my daughter. You're my daughter, right? Like, let's do this deal. She was so excited. I was upset one day in counseling and I said, my daughter's telling me she feels like she's being treated like she was adopted. And my therapist said, that's so interesting that you say that, because I don't even know which one of your children is adopted. She said, I'm not sure which one is. So I think the answer is yes. Now, whether or not the child is able to internalize that love, and when they're able to internalize that love, that's another question. I think something really profound happened. I'm guessing, I don't want to put it on you, when you were sitting in that room, not just for the experience of what this means for my daughter and what it means for me as a mom, but what it meant for your mom. And that maybe that the story that we digest with that break in the bond gets repaired a little bit, and seeing that love of that mother to her daughter and then making that choice. But I absolutely think you can love a child. I've actually had, this is not the first time I've actually been asked this question, because I adopted an adult. People are like, how do you, like, make space for that in your heart. And it's like, you don't, it just happens. The space grows. I think that's been my personal experience. I don't actually have a professional, like I've studied this and this is the way it works kind of response, more than like experiencing that profound love, as I'm sure you have with your girls. And I see it on Facebook, by the way, all the time in your posts that I love.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and I'll chime in to say, you know, whenever people ask me that question, my first answer is absolutely. And I remember one of the first things that my husband said to me when we were in the hospital with my oldest, our first adoption experience, right? Like, so a little backstory, he and I were high school sweethearts. And when we talked early on, like I'm talking before we were even 20 years old, we talked about what our family would look like. And we talked about biological children and adopted children. And I will say that, you know, I was always very determined that adoption would play a role, like we would have adopted children. He was not necessarily skeptical or hesitant, but he was definitely the one that had more questions and more concern. And I think if he had to say, and I don't want to speak for him, but I have heard him say this before, this was his ultimate question, right? Like he was born in a family where he was biologically the son of, you know, his parents, and his brother was his biological brother. So he didn't have that sort of experience that I had. And so his first question was like, it was sort of this, am I capable of loving another child as my own? Even though you don't ever want to say that out loud, right? Like, even though that may be what you're thinking. And I remember being in the hospital with my oldest, and one of the very first things he said to me, so after we got put in our room, our separate room with Ellery, and we're holding her, one of the first things he said was, I can't believe I ever had that thought. And he was like, I remember him saying, he was like, I actually, he made a joke of it. And he said, I don't even think I would love our own as much as I love this child. Like, it was almost like the opposite of like, I have so much more love in my heart than I thought I did. And I think it's so true. So the other thing I would say is, you know, we cover the topic in this month as well about transracial adoption. And, you know, are we capable of raising a child of another race? And the thing that Andra brought up on that podcast, which is so powerful, is she said, if you're asking the question, you're definitely capable because you have that awareness, right? And so again, it comes back to like, I love what you said about like creating the space, but allowing that space to grow naturally too. So I want to talk about, you know, this idea of environmental factors and building a relationship with our children. I'm interested just for my own life, right? Like wanting to know what are the ways that I can really create the positive cherry blossom experience for my children, right? To sort of when I don't necessarily know what those traumas were that birth mom or birth grandma had experienced. So I'd love to talk about the environmental factor piece.
I think it's important to really give credence to the fact that you're, you know, if you pay attention as a parent, you've got all this love that you're operating out of. So that's, you know, that's a great starting place. You have to listen to your children. You have to, and by listen, I don't just mean listen to what they're saying, but pay attention. I had a friend of mine one time come by my office. She said, oh my gosh, what did you just eat? And then I thought about it and I was like, oh, Rice Krispie treat. Apparently that depletes my energy. I did not know that. She was paying attention. She noticed that whatever I ate was not energizing for me. I think we as parents, we have to do that. We have to pay attention. If you notice, let's pretend for a second that what your child has inherited is a freakish fear of cherry blossom smells, right? You start putting it together. You notice that, that's interesting. Every time we're around cherry blossom smells, she gets really, really anxious. That's relevant. And I think I can speak for myself, and this is with my biological children, with my adopted daughter. My tendency is that I want to make everything positive. I want to get to the positivity. I want to get to the solution. I want to be optimistic and, you know, but if you do that, you sometimes miss out on the information, right? And the information is, oh, there's an issue with cherry blossom. So now you know what your issue is you have to deal with. There's also words that we use. What is your greatest fear that will happen when you smell cherry blossom? I'm afraid I'm going to die. I'm afraid, you know, whatever it is. And those reactions, when they are very, and cherry blossom is probably not the best example for this, but when they're very catastrophic, when it's like, I'll cease to exist, my life will be over, I'll be killed, it's something catastrophic, then you know that it's related to a break in the bond. That could be the break in the bond from the adoption experience, like we just talked about. It could be a break in the bond that is part of what was epigenetically inherited through generations. So you listen for the words that they say. The words are really critical to understanding what needs to be healed. So if you notice, back to the cherry blossom, my child is freaking out every time I've finally made this connection. It's every time we're around cherry blossom, she just falls apart. Then you start exploring and hearing, like, what are her reactions? What is she saying when she's freaking out? And then where the repair has to happen. And that's the cool thing about the nurture, right? Is that you get to be that environment that brings a calming, soothing effect that might have been honestly impossible or very difficult for a biological parent to bring, because they're wrapped up in the same DNA experience that you are. And when that happens, it becomes hard. If you're having a reaction to the cherry blossom smell at the same time your child reaction to the cherry blossom smell, you're maybe not in the presence of mind to pick up what that common theme is, right? But you do have that opportunity as an adoptive parent, because you're not swept away with it, because your genetic coding isn't the same. So as I see it, there's an opportunity to pay attention, really listen, make note of things. You might even if you start noticing it like at a certain age, that's another very good indicator that there's some kind of inherited family trauma, when at like 16, all of a sudden they start self-harming or talking about suicide or become really, really anxious. That's usually an indicator that if it happens at a specific age, or it happens at a specific experience, when you get pregnant or when you think about getting pregnant, like you were talking about, that there's just this like strong reaction, then that that's coming through that family imprint. So there's a lot of telltale signs. And then because you have a different inherited DNA, are able to stay in this space of calm and let them hold them in that. You're safe. I've got you, bringing that peace and that comfort. And over time, like with the mice who are retrained, you basically evolve and basically refresh that DNA and how it's expressed, so that the next generation that they pass on isn't dealing with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it made me think again about, I think you said this terminology off record, but we were talking prior to this, and you said, be a PI when it comes to your picking up on your child's language and their anxieties and fears and on all that kind of stuff. And hearing you talk just now makes me think about my youngest, who that's a whole story in itself, and I won't get too it's her story to share someday, but she definitely had a more traumatic physical in utero experience as far as health of birth mother, and birth mother had also been in a traumatic car accident when my youngest was in the womb. And so it's interesting, because even just hearing you say this, like, it pieces so many things together for me, because first of all, she was born with some midline defects, lip and tongue tie, and we sought out chiropractic and myofascial therapies and all these things that I eventually want to bring to the podcast, because it's been life-changing for her and for us. But we experienced, like, I would say the first 8 weeks of her life, especially before we got those things corrected, we felt like we were sort of like living in her trauma. Like, my husband and I were literally like, oh my gosh, like, what do we do? Whereas my oldest, like I said before, went pretty much straight to my chest within 5 minutes of being born. And, I would say it was a much more peaceful newborn experience. Like, everything was very calm. She was relatively easy as a newborn. Whereas my youngest, it was a totally different story. I was just telling some friends last night, she would not go to sleep unless the bottle was in her mouth, we were bouncing on a ball, and the shower was running. Like, we had to have all those different components, or a noise machine, or there was always so many things to help her soothe. And of course, part of that was she couldn't eat. So the lip and tongue tie played a big role in that. But the one thing that we always used to say that we couldn't figure out was, why does she hate the car? Like, we would put her in the car seat, to go 5 minutes down the road to the chiropractor. And it was literally 5 minutes of hell, like listening to her scream, blame her. And I kept telling my husband, I'm like, I feel like I'm traumatizing her by putting her in the car, but yet how am I supposed to go to the doctor? Or how am I supposed to go do these things? And it makes me think, like, of course, like hearing you say this, right? Like she had a traumatic car experience, like, you know, she had a traumatic in utero experience. And so a lot of that plays a role into who she is and those fears. Now, I'm not saying that this has been like fully corrected by any means, but it's interesting because thanks to Big Sis, who loves the car, right? Like my now 2-year-old she loves to get in the car. We play music in the car. We make the car fun, right? Like we're doing these things that are just sort of like, again, it's sort of reshaping that environment, reshaping that experience. But this is such a cool thing, like such an interesting topic. I definitely want to check out this guy's book and do more research on this myself. But
that language though, that you have, that what you just said though, about that you knew about the accident, you may have already done a reparative experience by the time, you know, she gets older, but before she had language, she had an experience. And before she had language, she had a reaction, right? Because of what she inherited. And you have language for it because you know what happened.
mm-hmm.
You know about this car accident. And you don't always have that information. And if you don't, I really want the hope and promise of this conversation to be, you can still heal it. However, if you do have the language for it, to be able to, that happens so often. You know, it was the shame of the family that Susie got pregnant when she was 12 and she had to have an abortion. So nobody talked about it. And that is going to absolutely get passed on from generation to generation, or I shouldn't say from generation to generation, in that it may not be expressed right in a generation. Right. And then it comes out in a cousin or something like that. And it's like, they have no idea what's going on with that. And you got to talk about it. You got to put that stuff out there when you have the language for it. If you don't, be a private investigator, like you were just saying. Yeah, that's like, you know, listening at people. If you ever do epigenetic counseling, I saw a woman for a while and I was just like, she hones in on the words, like, right. And then she hones into the powerful words, right? Yeah. I would cease to exist. That's powerful, right? Holy crap. I'm afraid that if XYZ happened, I would cease to exist. Well, what would happen what are you afraid would happen if you cease to exist? Nobody would know I was around. Nobody would know, like, whatever that is, you dig into it and you really become the expert on it so that you can help them heal that. And then how is that experienced in the body, right? And healing that. But it's so amazing how they just hone in on those words, and you have a story. So use it if it's necessary, you know, to say, yeah, you were in an accident in your mom's utero. It makes sense. This is really scary for you. I've got you. Like, you know, it's bringing that calming in. And maybe her sister, I was thinking if you were sitting in the back seat and your husband's driving, if you arranged things in a way where you're there being calming and loving. And so there's this new experience that's happening. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. But if you let's say you didn't know that story, right? Right. Something happened to somebody in a car. You still know what's happening. You still see, like, okay, something's up here because this is happening every time we get in the car. Right. Exactly. And that is really cool, right? Like if you just pay attention, you go, okay, instead of thinking, why is she doing this? This is so frustrating. You know what I mean? Right. Saying, okay, this is information. This is a sign. It's a sign. Yeah. Well, it makes me think too, like, you know, I just listened to a podcast from a functional medicine practitioner's podcast, and he was talking about how, you know, a lot of people think that your physicality and your body composition, whether you're overweight or not, et cetera, depends solely on your genetics. Like a lot of people say, like, well, it's my genetics, or I'm just big boned, or, you know, I'm like I have the physique of my mother or whatever. And I forget the percentage that he said, but it was actually a much smaller percentage than I ever thought was actually genetic when it comes to your body. Like there's so much control that we do have over our overall physique. Now, that's not to say that genetics doesn't play a role, right? But there's so much control that we do have as far as what we eat, if and how we move, right? All those different things. Supplementation. So I'm saying that because the analogy is the same for this, right? There's so much that
genetics does play a role in, but I think what you're saying is we're starting to learn that these environmental factors and these, relationships that are just different and healthier, maybe like these types of things can really sort of impact and transform the child on the inside.
Yeah. The one thing I do want to say, and I imagine you know this all too well, is that a common experience of children who are adopted is to feel in some way different than their family, to feel alienated in a way, alone, because they have this, they're experiencing things in a different way, right? Than that, because they don't have this match in how their DNA is expressed. And again, totally normal, totally like, absolutely. And our tendency, it's just kind of like, again, you lose somebody that you love and somebody says to you, it'll be okay. And you're like, thanks, it's real shaming because it's not okay. Right. Like, yeah. I know you're trying to be helpful, but that just made me feel bad about myself because I'm supposed to be reflecting on how it's going to be okay. And somehow that's supposed to make me okay. Mm-hmm. I think it's a similar thing that like, we want to comfort our child. So we want to say, no, you're a part of us. However, I think, again, listening and not immediately dismissing out of hand that experience of feeling different. You are different. You have this inheritance, right? That's this rich inheritance that you've come into this life with. And some of it's really hard and some of it's probably really great. And it does make you different. That's not bad, right? Like, I love you and I'm here and making space for you. But I think, again, I know my sense, again, trying to make it better, trying to like usher in the positivity. Sometimes you can miss out on like acknowledging the experience of it. And that, again, the embodied experience, I feel tense, or I feel like I just want to go in my room and just, I kind of feel this like desire to push away and really, being able to hold them and talk about that real stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, instead of trying to dismiss it. And again, no person, I don't think, on the planet, when they say it'll be okay, is trying to shame the person that they're saying it to. Mm-hmm. It just is, in my opinion, it is.
It's like how our society walks around saying I'm fine, and like,
correct.
99% of people are not fine in that moment. You know what I mean? It's the same idea. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've mentioned, my brother and I were both adopted at birth. We're not biological brother and sister, but this is something that I've tried to explain to my husband. And then, my brother and I are very close. Not physically, he lives across the country, but I love him dearly. I look out for him. We had some interesting childhood experiences. Like I think I mentioned on our previous podcast, like my dad was diagnosed with cancer when I was 12, he was 8. It was a traumatic experience. My parents moved across the country to pursue a bone marrow transplant. We lived with another woman, a friend of my mom's, and my grandparents basically helped raise us during that period of our life. So we've experienced some things together, right? So not only did we sort of both have adoption stories, we went through some things together too. And so we're very close and our bond is very close. But I've always said, and I think he would agree, that we could not be more different. Like, I can totally tell that there's no biological connection. Mm-hmm. In not just, and I'm not just talking personality, right? It's not about like introvert versus extrovert. It's not like that. It's right. Like, no, there are just some ways that I don't and can't understand him. Right. And I'm sure there are ways that he just can't and doesn't understand me. That doesn't mean we can't talk about it. It doesn't mean that we can't. I mean, he's actually a psychologist himself. So he likes to really think about the thinking. But it's something that I've always sensed, like even from a very young age, like that we have this bond that's like a relational bond, but there's always been sort of a hole there that I totally see. Right. And I think that obviously is the case for the parental hole, so to speak, as well. So this is so fascinating. And I want to make sure that we touch on, what epigenetic counseling looks like, because epigenetic counseling is sort of, as you said, some new stuff, right? This is something that if you Google it, you're not going to find a whole lot about because this is really new. What does that look like? Is it talk therapy? Is it, tell us more about what that experience is like.
So typically what they'll do is they'll start off by, and the woman that I saw, I don't know if it's always framed out this way, although it is definitely recommended to start off with like a 2-hour session. And you spend the first bit of the session really finding out about the grandparents. What were they like? What were the characteristics used to describe them? What was their relationship like with your parent? How did your parent describe them? What would, your parents' relationship, any divorces, separations, big events, anything like that. So you're basically looking for, now, obviously, if you have, with an adoption, you don't have, you may have just bits and pieces of that. You might not have anything. I mean, it really kind of depends on the circumstance. But you basically fill in kind of like this genealogy, if you will. And then the second part is really digging into the core language. The things that we were talking about is like, and it's so funny because I did a session with this woman, you say, so what is your greatest fear that would happen? And she said, whatever her greatest fear was, I'm afraid that I won't be able to help other people or something like that. And I said, well, what's your greatest fear that would happen if you weren't able to help other people? Well, something might happen to them. Well, what's your greatest fear? And we literally just kept going. And I kind of, after a while, I felt really obnoxious. You know what I mean? I was just like, she's probably like, stop asking me. And so we go through this whole thing until I feel like I've gotten to the core language. The core thing is, I won't be taken care of, or whatever it was. I can't remember what her thing was. And so then what you do is then you do the last part is a meditation, right? Where you have this sense of, and in this instance, it was her mom coming into the room, and you're aware that your mom is there, and you're breathing, and you're getting a sense of calm and peace and everything. And then mom comes, you have mom step in 3 feet where she could, her knees could touch your knees. And how do you feel that in your body? And then she backs up. And it's this sense of bringing that calm, like we were talking about, being held, and this language of, mom, I know you did the best that you could. I know that you loved me and that you want the best for me. And when you come close, I have a tendency to want to take care of you. And I know you wouldn't want that for me. And so it's retracing kind of this sense of like, what that core language is, right? And so you create this meditation, and then that can be recorded, and you can re-listen to it to do the work again and again. So I finished this session with this woman, and we're debriefing afterwards. She said, oh my gosh, you kept asking me, about this. And she said, it was so powerful. I mean, I literally was thinking she was going to say it was so annoying, but she said it was so powerful as I got deeper and deeper and understood the real fear, the real impact. And we were just doing a practice session. So we had like 20, 30 minutes or something like that to even do it. So it was like a real compressed kind of time. So even in that compressed time frame, and doing the meditation in like 5 minutes, which it could be, your meditation might be up to 30 minutes. It was still so powerful because we went super deep on that fear and what are you afraid would happen if that, and what are you afraid of would happen at that. It's really amazing. I went through my own epigenetic counseling, and there was this one point when we were doing the training, we had the person comes in or whatever, and I just immediately felt my hands going up and pushing my mom away. And when we did the debriefing, I realized that I had this sense that she wanted to know what was upsetting me, but that as I told her what was upsetting me, it was going to upset her. And then I was going to start taking care of her feelings about me being upset. And I didn't have the capacity to take care of her feelings. So I just wanted her to stay at a distance. And Joanna Lynn is the person that I'd worked with. And she said, it's important to remember boundaries don't protect us from others. They protect us from what we give away too much, right? It's not that we're putting up a boundary to keep mom away, it's that we're putting up a boundary to keep us in. And so it just, again, it really shows you, I think, the profound impact of language, but also language connected to my internal experience in my body. How do I feel in my body? I feel rigid. I feel defended. I feel myself like wanting to push my head back up against the wall, like, and then being able to come into a place of calm and breathing into that and knowing I don't have to take responsibility for that. And that my mom doesn't want me to take responsibility for her. She was doing the best she could. And retraining that. I think one of the things that came out of that for me too is just this awareness that sometimes in our language, and this is important, we talked about this last time too, I think, is this orders of love, right? Love should flow from grandma, grandpa, down to child, and from child down to grandchild. But oftentimes we end up as children taking care of our parents. And that can happen too, that you notice that your adopted child is trying to take care of you emotionally rather than the other way around. That was really powerful for me because I realized that even though it seemed really healthy to say to my child, when you do that, it hurts my feelings, it made her responsible for my feelings. And that reverse orders the love. So instead saying, I need you to stop doing that, instead we're going to do this, but not you're responsible for me because it hurts my feelings. I'm upset and take care of me. So I think it can take some different forms, but a lot of times they're going to want to do those three components in the epigenetic counseling experience.
That story that you just told of like you said it on the first podcast too, that whole idea of like responsibility for feelings made me rethink some of the ways that I speak to my kids, right? Like sometimes when I get really upset with, especially my oldest, right? When there was a discipline issue or something, sometimes she'll say, well, why? Like if I say, stop doing blah, blah, blah. She'll say, why? And I think prior to talking to you, I would have been like, because it makes mommy feel really anxious, or it makes mommy feel really this and that. And it's made me have this awareness of saying, I don't have to explain to her why. It's just a matter of please stop, right? Like, and not making her responsible for my feelings. So I think that's huge, whether that goes for anyone, right? Regardless of adoption. So we're running close to being out of time, but I want to make sure that I ask you, I know that you work with the chosen organization. So foster care is something that you're familiar with. And we've focused a lot of this on, of course, probably because it's my own story. I was adopted as an infant. My children were adopted as infants, but foster care is another angle of adoption, right? And so I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about with, what are the pieces of the child's story that you do know? Like with my youngest, I know the piece about the car trauma. Right. And with foster care, I think probably there's more opportunity to know what those traumas might be, at least to some degree. And so, whereas with infant adoption, sometimes all you get is a biological history and that's about it. So is there anything there that we should touch on before we wrap up today that you can think of as it pertains to just foster care and maybe the differences with the trauma?
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about obviously inherited family trauma, and we're talking about epigenetic counseling, and all of that is very relevant, I think, in a foster care population. However, you don't end up in a foster care population without living your own trauma. And so that is that situation where you go in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed thinking, I'm going to change their world by loving them. And you are, that probably is. And they're going to be so appreciative, right? And they start off really appreciative. And then their coping strategies start emerging that may not seem as appreciative. It may be anger or acting out in some way, and so I think, there's just so much, and there's the break in the bond, obviously, but there's the break in the bond that probably happened before the actual break in the bond, if that makes sense. Like mom wasn't, maybe mom was physically there, but mom wasn't emotionally there. Mom was not trustworthy. Mom was scary. Dad was scary. Dad was in and out of the house. Dad died, and then mom like completely unplugged, or mom died and dad completely, or dad went to prison. So there's going to be a break in the bond, but there may be multiple layers of that because of the trauma that happened before they get put into the system. And then the system isn't perfect. And I say that that's the understatement, right, of the century. That's why I love Jenny and her organization and the work they're doing, because they actually work with the parents, and through working with the parents, they transform the experience of the child. And they're seeing huge improvements in the child's outcomes in terms of depression, anxiety, all these different things. Why? Because they're working with the parents. They're equipping the parents. They don't even do counseling with the child. Like, they do a biopsychosocial on the parents. It's super awesome. And it's equipping, because we all have our stuff. We all have our stories, and helps us align to an understanding, again, not being reactive to, right, our child's, because that's the natural thing to do, right? Like, somebody's freaking out. It's not like you're like, oh, I am zen and calm and even, especially when it's your child, right? And it's in your home and so I think that becomes really, really critical, is to stay sober in your expectations, but also to be, again, that private investigator, really listening to that language and figuring out what's going on. And the most obscure kind of thing that you think could not be a coping strategy that saved their life. I promise you. If they're cutting, if they're suicidal, it's like, if I'm suicidal, that gives me an out. If my abuse experience is so traumatic, fight, flight, freeze, whatever, then of course I want out. So that makes sense. So, trying to, again, in that instance, say, basically, don't be suicidal or whatever, in whatever way that we're saying that, is to say, how has that served you? Right? Like, because it has any coping strategy, cutting, not eating, any of the coping strategies that are typically maladaptive, they save their life and now it's taking their life from them. So I just think it's really important to be curious. I love the expression. I think I shared this with you last time, be curious and not furious, because I love that expression.
Yeah.
I think that's a beneficial thing to do in life, in work, in any interaction, to try to stay curious with ourselves, probably first and foremost, right? Don't be furious with yourself. Oh, I can't believe I just did that, but be curious.
Yeah.
What's going on, that happened. And
so good. Well, I think, I think at the end of the day, like, we are walking around in a society that I've been saying this a lot lately. We're walking around in a society, and maybe it's worse because of the pandemic lately and whatnot, but we're so, everyone is self-absorbed, right? Like, everybody's first priority is themselves, as it should be. But at the same time, like, I feel like there's just this lack of emotional intelligence that exists in our society. Blame it on technology, blame it on masking and pandemic life. Like, I don't know. But to me, like, just being self-aware is step one, but being aware of the emotions of others that are around you is so key, and something that's often forgotten and just not part of, we do professional development and we do all these different things, but we don't look sometimes at, how can I be a better person in my relationships? And I'm connecting this here because I think it matters when it comes to adoption, because it matters. I would go to the extent to say more so than maybe it would with a biological child, because you do have to be, like you said, that private investigator. You do have to pick up on that language. You do have to pick up on insecurities, anxieties, fears, and as we should all be doing with our children, right? But it's just it's like another level. It's like another, it's this out of body experience. Like, how can I elevate myself to 30,000 foot view of what's going on in this situation? How can I be in tune with my child's emotions to understand where this is coming from? Like, is this coming from something environmental? Is this coming from something genetic, right? Like, is this coming from something that we need to work on? So, we've kind of come full circle, and I want to make sure that we end sort of where we started, which is making sure that listeners know that, again, adoption is this mutual feeling. It's this mutual experience of both loss and joy. And if there's one thing that I have to say, I mean, of course, my goal with this month is to bring about, again, awareness so that people go into this confidently, so that they know what to expect, so that they know how to grow in their emotional intelligence when it comes to this. But I also want to just say, like, the joy overshadows the sadness so much. And this epigenetic theory, this idea of environment and nurture, is now proving what I've already experienced, which is that the joy piece is so much more powerful than the sadness, right? And it would not be as joyful without the sadness. So I just want to bring that sort of first full circle. And again, thank you so much for being on here. I'll make sure to link up in the show notes for everyone how they can find you. Again, she's the best-selling author of Resolve to Rise, Become Greater Than Your Circumstances. I'll also link up the book in the show notes. Any last thoughts before we close up?
I did. That's why I was looking away from the camera for a second here, just to say that there is this book that I was encouraged to look into, and I wanted to tell everybody about, because I think it isn't about epigenetic counseling, but it is called No Drama Discipline. And it's by Daniel Siegel and Tina Bryson. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I really recommend it. And it was just, what made me think about it was when we were talking about how we can speak to our children and stay curious and not furious, and help them navigate some difficult things, because we actually aren't trying to make sure, our ultimate goal isn't to make sure that they know we are the authority and they are to listen to us. Our ultimate goal is to help them be equipped to live a fulfilling life.
Yeah.
And so how we show up as parents and how we parent needs to communicate that, right? That I'm invested in equipping you to live a really great life. So I really would, if you haven't seen that book, I just highly recommend that.
Yeah.
And thank you so much again. I love having conversations with you. I think we're really aligned. And I think the more we can align more people who are trying to bring some goodness and joy into this world, and healing and healthy language, the better.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, my friend. Well, thank you so much for being on here. Listeners, I hope you've gained some insights here and some awareness for yourself, and are learning about the love and joy of adoption as we go through this month. So thank you so much, Lilli, for being here. I know we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.